long ago, a preacher had closed out a revival in our town and had boarded on a train on his long journey back home. He went back and he sat next to a young man, and he thought he'd start up a conversation with him by mentioning something about the weather. But the young man didn't answer him, so they rode on a while in silence. But after a while, the preacher heard the young man break out into sobs. Preacher, turning and saw the tears running off the cheek of his face, said, "Son, I'm a minister, and I'd like to help you in some way if I can." The young man replied, "Yes, preacher, I've got to talk to somebody. You see, about 2 years ago, I got so mean and I got so wicked that it went as far as one day as to strike my dad with my fist. My dad told me, 'Son, you've got so mean that I'm going to have to ask you to leave home. You're worrying your mother half to death.' So I left that day an angry young man. Boy, I was mad at the world. I was mad at my family. Got hooked up with the wrong crowd. I began to drink some, preacher. Drinking led to smoking marijuana, and smoking marijuana led to drugs. And to pay for our habit, we began to burglarize homes. We began to steal, preacher, and we got caught. And I spent some time in prison, preacher, no doubt. Mom and Dad read about it in the newspaper. And no doubt their hearts were broken. No doubt they were tore up inside because their son was in prison. But preacher, about 2 weeks ago, I found myself walking down an old lonely road. Had a bottle of strong drink in my hand. And all of a sudden, I heard some music. Oh, and I heard some sweet music like I've never heard before. And I got to looking, and the music was coming from a little old white church out in the field. So I found myself moving closer and closer to the church, and I found myself on the porch. Oh, the singing was so good, preacher. Seemed like it soothed my inward being. But after a while, I heard a preacher get up and begin to preach. He preached about a young man that had wasted all of his substance in riotous living, left his father, and went to the world, and he wasted it all. Found himself, losing all of his money, losing all of his substance. He found himself in a far country feeding swine, and was so hungry that he would have thought he would have ate from the husk of the swine. But the preacher said the young man came to himself. Yeah. He says, "I've got a father back home whose servants is doing a lot better than I am. I will go back to my father and tell him I'm not worthy to be thy son. Just let me be one of the hired servants." But the preacher said when he started and got close to home that the father was looking down the road. Yeah. Wow. Saw the young man coming, saw his son coming home. He lit out and went to meet him, and he locked his arm around his neck and says, "Oh, Father, I'm not worthy to be called your son." I believe he said, "Just hush." He said, "Bring the best robe, bring shoes and put on his feet, put a ring on his finger, kill the fatted calf. Let's have a feast because my son who was lost is now found, thank God." Amen. And all of a sudden, he gave an invitation. And boy, I went through the doorway and found myself at an old-fashioned altar. And the Lord gloriously, and wondrously saved my soul. Yes, and the first thing that come to my mind was dear old Mom and Dad. I sat down that night and I wrote Dad a letter. I says, "Dad, if you could find it in your heart to forgive me, to let me come on back home and I'd be on this train." Well, this kind of confused the preacher a little bit. So he asked the young man, "How are you going to know that your father's forgiven you? How are you going to know everything's going to be all right when you get home?" And the young man says, "Preacher, for all my life, we've lived here by these railroad tracks in a little home. And out in the backyard of that home place stands a great big apple tree. I wrote and asked Dad if he could find his heart to forgive me just to hang a little white flag on that apple tree and I'd get off. Well, just a little while, the young man began to break out and began to cry. He says, "Preacher, I'm almost home, and I can't bear to look." "Oh, I'm almost home, preacher, and I can't bear to look." The preacher said, "That'll be all right, son. I'll look for you." Hey, man, he reached over and wiped the frost away from the window, looked out, turned back around with a big smile on his face, said, "Son, you've not got a thing in this world to worry about." Look like Dad's got out early. He's tied a white flag on every limb of that apple tree. Looks like that old apple tree's in full bloom. You know that Dad loves you. You know Mama loves you. But I'm so glad to know this morning that we have a Father yonder in heaven who demonstrated and showed his sign of love when he allowed his darling Son to hang on Calvary's tree. Thank God for a God that so loved us. Aren't you glad, amen, that he loved you this morning?